American University in Bulgaria.
Dr. Stavrakakis is a very well-known figure in Lacanian psychoanalysis and the political, the concept of the political and the idea of radical democracy. He's the author of Lacan in the Political, published by Routledge in, when was it? 1999. And most recently, a book called The Lacanian Left, which was 2007, if I recall correctly. He's published widely, very widely, on the concept of Lacan and political and radical democracy. And also is an old friend of mine, Thessaloniki, and actually from the UK, where I think we first met a long time ago. The title of his talk this evening is Psychoanalysis in Society, Prohibition, Enjoyment, and the New Spirit of Capitalism.
The spirits of capitalism, because there are at least two.
Okay.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the American University in Bulgaria and the Institute for the invitation, and also to thank personally Jean and my friend Sean. It is a real pleasure to be here. Now, during the last few decades, psychoanalysis has increasingly been influencing political theory and sociocultural analysis, and I think we can only mention the name Zizek in order to get a feeling of that, somebody who has published numerous books translated to many, many languages about psychoanalysis and political theory. My lecture today aims at clarifying the relevance of some psychoanalytic concepts and theories for the analysis of social phenomena, and particularly for the analysis of the economy and economic behavior. Indeed, psychoanalysis, and especially Lacanian theory, can account for obedience and attachment to organized frameworks of social life, for the relation between subjects and the social bond, the social order, in at least two ways. First, by focusing on the symbolic presuppositions of authority and power, and second, by exploring the role of fantasy and enjoyment of the affective domain, let's say, in sustaining types of identification forms of behavior. Entering into a dialogue with a largely marginalized today tradition of political economy and sociological theory, going back to Max Weber, Werner Sombart, and other figures, this approach, the psychoanalytic approach, can, I think, convincingly account for our attachment to the two dominant spirits of capitalism within modernity. So my talk will be mainly about this hypothesis that we have two spirits, in the Weberian sense, two spirits of capitalism that characterize modernity. And this is a hypothesis which is both traditional sociology and postmodern sociologists like Baudrillard seem to be accepting. Focusing on the dialectic between the two spirits, such an exploration promises to illuminate what is at stake in the global economic crisis from the point of view of the ethico-political regulation of subjectivity, and perhaps to map anew our current European predicament. Now, where shall we start? Perhaps we should start from austerity, an emerging nodal point within the signifying fabric of our globalized public sphere, at least European public sphere. As one reads in Wikipedia, Merriam-Webster's dictionary named the word austerity as its word of the year for 2010. Of course, because of the number of web searches this word generated that year. And living in Greece at the heart of the European credit crisis, debt crisis, having lost almost 30% of my salary during the last couple of years, I couldn't agree more with that. Indeed, just from following the media, one learns very quickly that today's battle, both at the global and domestic level, is one between those responsible forces advocating and enforcing austerity and those irresponsible ones risking public spending and debt increases. In some cases, the relationship between the two models institutes or is supposed to institute a paradoxical equilibrium. This is the case, for example, with the US-China lending relationship. In most cases, however, the two models are presented as two opposing poles in a clash of cosmological proportions. To return to the debt crisis troubling Europe, the aggressive version of the austerity model is clearly associated with German neoliberal asceticism. Let me draw here from a recent article by Nobelist Paul Krugman, commenting on the views of the German Minister of Finance, Wolfgang Schäuble, expressed in an article in the Financial Times, characteristically entitled, the article by Schäuble, "Why Austerity is Only Cure for the Eurozone." And I'm quoting now from Krugman. If you had any doubts about where key figures in Europe are going, this should clear them up. Governments in and beyond the Eurozone need not just to commit to fiscal consolidation and improved competitiveness, they need to start delivering on this now. So austerity now, and never mind concerns about deepening the slum. The confidence fairy will come to our rescue, and anyway, pain is good for the soul. What's so striking about all this, Krugman continues, from an economist's point of view, is the absence of anything that sounds like a model. It's all about virtue and vice, with just the assumption that virtue will be rewarded. End of quote. However, isn't this precisely what a model is about? In fact, I think what Krugman describes does constitute a model precisely on the grounds that Krugman finds inadmissible. That is to say, on the grounds of relying on the virtue-vice distinction, of using ethical condemnation, stigmatization and scapegoating, not to mention surveillance and punishment, through the infamous Troika mechanisms. I don't know whether you are familiar with that. Troika is a commission composed of representatives of the International Monetary Fund, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, that visits every 3 months the country which has entered the European mechanism in order to make sure that everything is going according to plan. And there's a whole process around these visits. You know, anxiety before, what will happen, punishment, and so on and so forth. In most cases, what is usually at stake is the regulation of the social bond through shock and awe, guilt and shame, pathologization and salvation narratives. And this is clearly the Greek experience, and I think the overall experience of the so-called pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, a characterization in itself revealing of all these language games with shame, punishment, and so on and so forth. Now, there are certainly innovative trends here in this European asceticism, such as, for example, the determination to introduce constitutional provisions on debt. This was one of the decisions passed at the last European Union Summit in early December 2011. But overall, this is far from new. On a first level, it reminds us of failed policies of the 1920s and 30s. When Secretary of the Treasury Mellon had been advising American President Herbert Hoover, and I quote from what Hoover describes in his memoirs, that Mellon was telling him when Hoover would go to him and say, but you know, things are falling apart, society is falling apart, people are starving. And Mellon would tell him the following: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people. End of quote. On a second level, another association that comes to mind is the knot between a moral sense of obligation, a distinct ethical mode, a superegoic, if you want, categorical imperative, and economic behavior that Max Weber captures with the word spirit in his very well-known classic, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And it is interesting to note that in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, Karl Marx also refers to the morality, the doctrine of asceticism, to account for roughly the same type of socioeconomic behavior. So the main idea here is that economic behavior cannot be properly studied, understood, without examining this ethico-political regulation which is always involved. Now, the current crisis seems to call for a renewed analysis of this spiritual dimension. And although a necessary first step, it is not sufficient to supplement the first ascetic spirit with another spirit associated with an ambiguous consumer and employee freedom and autonomy. There is this debate in sociology, political economy, that we have two spirits. The first one is the one described by Weber, and the other one which probably enters the horizon after the Second World War, I will say a few words about that later on, is exactly the opposite, a reversal. Not asceticism, but consumption, enjoyment, and so on and so forth. And it has been also, there's this famous book by Boltanski and Chapello, The Second Spirit of Capitalism, which deals with that second spirit. So, in my view, it is not enough to distinguish the two spirits and stay at that level. What is also necessary is first to grasp the exact way spirits function in over-determining social behavior and sustaining hegemonic orders, creating, in other words, the intersubjective network needed for the production of relations of domination. We need, in other words, to enhance our understanding of the two spirits of capitalism, the spirit of ascetic prohibition and that of commanded enjoyment. Here, Lacanian theory can greatly enhance the long, if marginalized, tradition, highlighting the importance of the two spirits. For example, drawing on the enjoyment explosion surrounding us in consumer society, Lacanian theorist Todd McGowan has put forward the hypothesis that it marks a significant shift in the structure of the social bond, in the organization of the social fabric. In his view, it marks the passage from what he calls a society of prohibition into a society of commanded enjoyment. While more traditional forms of social organization required subjects to renounce the private enjoyment in the name of social duty, today, McGowan points out, today he is writing 10 years ago, the situation is slightly different now. Today, he says, the only duty seems to consist in enjoying oneself as much as possible. So these are the two spirits. According to this perspective, the classical bourgeois attitude and bourgeois political economy was initially based on postponement, the deferral of jouissance, patient retention with a view to the supplementary jouissance, enjoyment that is calculated. Accumulate in order to accumulate, produce in order to produce. This is the first spirit of capitalism, associated with a sense of professional duty based on rational asceticism, a gradually secularized version of Protestant asceticism, and the tabooing of enjoyment, conspicuous consumption, and luxury. One of the well-known nodal points of this framework of sacrifice was saving. So from that first spirit, we then pass into the second spirit, which is a reversal of the first one, and has to do with command. Everybody is commanded to enjoy and not to save. Of course, now we're experiencing a trend back. I haven't seen these advertisements for saving for 30, 40 years in Greece, and they emerged again this year.
The mutual engagement between language and enjoyment, symbolic and real, beatific and horrific fantasies. In effect, what a Lacanian perspective highlights is the non-teleological dialectic between subject and big other. Big other is social order, social reality. A dialectic which operates, unfolds in a variety of distinct but deeply interimplicated levels. On the one hand, at the level of the symbolic, of sociosemiotic construction, a more normative level. On the other, at the level of affective investment, of the mobilization of the passions, of what Lacan calls jouissance, enjoyment. Of course, the question is how these two are connected. Now, at this stage, now that I'm beginning to bring together psychoanalysis and social and political theory, maybe doubts will begin to emerge. And I think that anybody doubting the relevance of psychoanalytic theory in the analysis of such socioeconomic dynamics, anybody discouraged by the specter of reductionism, should keep in mind the observation of a great sociologist, Norbert Elias, according to whom categories like individual and society do not refer to a priori different objects existing separately, but rather to different yet inseparable sides of the same object, of the same human beings, human social beings. In a similar vein, in his famous Rome discourse in 1952, referring to the relation between psychoanalysis and history and to his own use of historical concepts and examples in the illumination of clinical problems and challenges, Lacan denies the need for the slightest conceptual displacement, translation, or adaptation. There is no need to carry these remarks into the analytic domain, since they are already there, Lacan says. It is thus far from surprising that as we enter his highly sophisticated and complex work of the 1960s and 1970s, the distinction between individual and collective itself becomes the object of a relentless deconstruction. From a Lacanian point of view, such a distinction does not exist. It cannot claim any validity beyond its artificial elevation within Enlightenment's self-understanding in scientific, legal, and political discourse. This is, after all, the paradox revealed in the psychoanalytic clinic, the major source of inspiration for psychoanalytic theory. The clinic is not about some sort of extra-social encounter, that between an analyst and an analysand, conceived as pre-constituted autonomous individuals. On the contrary, the analytic relationship itself is made possible through the mediating role of social institutions such as discourse and language, without which no social bond can be established. The symbolic universe of civilization and culture provides a terrain within which the analytic relation, the so-called talking cure, acquires its intersubjective meaning and from which it draws its material. No wonder then that an individual symptom, if the formulation of such an abstraction is momentarily allowed, is never alien to what Freud calls discontents in civilization. So, individual symptom and discontent in civilization are two sides of the same coin. Indeed, what initially appears as purely individual is always implicated within a social dynamic, and vice versa. Every social regulation, political command, calls for its subjective description, its embodiment. Without them, it remains powerless. For example, isn't it the case that in modernity, individuation and individualism have progressed hand in hand with state-sanctioned disciplinary and biopolitical techniques and the massification of culture? At the same time that to speak about increasing individualism, individualization, and so on and so forth, we have massification, mass culture, popular culture, and so on and so forth. Is it the case that already from the historical beginnings of capitalism, the idea of individual interest as a central axis of human behavior was posited as a social duty? And this is not something that pointed out by psychoanalysts. You can read the very well-known book by Albert Hirschman, The Passions and the Interests, which makes exactly that point. And hasn't the drive to individual consumption, if we take the second spirit of capitalism, functioned as a social force par excellence, which sustained for many decades the whole economic, social, and political edifice of late capitalist societies? Simply put, even when psychoanalysis insists that the role of the subject needs to be taken seriously into account in social and political analysis, or rather, precisely then, this call does not imply a return to the individual level marked by some intrinsic essentialist features of humanity. So, the individual is not the same with the subject. Subjectivity marks, above all else, an ontological gap always implicated in a dialectic of civilizational, social, and political dynamics. Moving beyond banal individualism, which today is more likely to be found in mainstream social science currents like the rational choice paradigm, rather than in psychoanalytically inspired social and political theory, Lacan stresses the importance of the subject as lacking, permitting thus a thorough grasping of the ways the organized other, the social order, attempts to deal with this lack through a synergy of representational, symbolic, and libidinal means, discursive and affective means, through the split and articulation between language and enjoyment. Now, contemporary social and political theory has thoroughly registered this mutual engagement between these levels, highlighted by psychoanalytic theory, and I could give you a lot of examples. One of them is the theory of ideology, in which, in this area, both Slavoj Žižek and Ernesto Laclau have advanced similar projects. Which highlight the mutual engagement between these two levels. For example, in Zizek's case, already in his first book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, published in 1989, Zizek recasts ideology critique as a two-step project. The first step is always discursive, has to do with how a particular ideology is articulated at the discursive level, what types of signifiers we find there, what are the nodal points, what stands at the periphery, what stands at the center of a particular discourse, of a particular ideology. The second step, however, aims at extracting, and I'm quoting here from Zizek, at extracting the kernel of enjoyment, at articulating the way in which, beyond the field of meaning, but at the same time internal to it, an ideology implies, manipulates, produces some sort of enjoyment structure in facts. And Ernesto Laclau has recently introduced this distinction between form and force. We can study the form a particular discourse or particular ideology takes, but in order to explain its hegemonic role, for example, we need also to account for the force, for the investment which exists there. Now, we can return to that in the discussion if we want to. Now, how can this type of inquiry help us make sense of the current crisis? The key word here is mutual engagement. That these two levels don't exist separately. They exist always in a very close articulation. Now, if today the battle between austerity and spending, the return of ascetic prohibition and its clash with the faltering commanded enjoyment is presented as a major clash between two antithetical alternatives, the type of inquiry put forward here entitles us to ask whether this is really the case. What if what appears as antithesis, as a true ethico-political battle between competing models, and claims to mark the horizon of the possible, that you only have these two options, conceals an extimate, a paradoxical relation of mutual engagement, producing a single bipolar system? It may sound as counterintuitive, but we have a similar scenario in many different cases. In fact, even a degree of transgression, going back to ideology, even a degree of transgression is often implicitly encouraged by a dominant discourse, by dominant ideology, and is thus, in most cases, reinforcing its grip. To retain its grip, every hegemonic ideology needs to take into advance its own failure, its own limits, and to condition its own partial transgression. Here we see the lacking other and incomplete power structure. No power structure is complete. Indirectly acknowledging this lack, allowing a certain degree of disidentification, providing a breathing space for its subjects, on the condition, of course, that this remains under control. And I think here Zizek has produced a very interesting formulation. He says, ideology is effective precisely by constructing a space of false disidentification. It is impossible to capture the way hegemonic order is reproduced without bringing to light this mutual engagement between reproduction and transgression, and without charting an alternative course beyond the short circuit present in such cases. Now, needless to say, this, again, once more, such a type of inquiry is not limited within psychoanalytically inspired sociopolitical theory and analysis. And I have been reading recently the new book by a very important Italian philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, which is called The Kingdom and the Glory. And Agamben advances a very similar type of argument, aiming at destabilizing, deconstructing established polarities. In particular, Agamben takes issue with the two paradigms dominating the constitution and development of Western societies. And I will read a very short quote by Agamben. Political theology, he says, which founds the transcendence of sovereign power on the single God, and economic theology, which replaces this transcendence with the idea of an economia conceived as an immanent ordering domestic and not political in the strict sense, of both divine and human life. Political philosophy and the modern theory of sovereignty derive from the first paradigm of political theology. Modern biopolitics, up to the current triumph of economy and government over every aspect of social life, derive from the second paradigm. So you have Agamben narrates the whole history of Western civilization in terms of these two forces. Now, his analysis, however, reveals that although often presented in oppositional terms of a radical splitting, the two paradigms, the political and economic vocabularies, enter a relation of mutual contamination, with a radical gap and at the same time a necessary solidarity established between them. As he concludes, the two paradigms live together and intersect with one another to the point of constituting a bipolar system, whose understanding, preliminary conditions, and interpretation of the political history of the West. It thus becomes, according to Agamben, very important to study the forms of the relations and operations to turn our focus from one or the other system separately to the choreography of their mutual engagement. Now, what if the battle between austerity and spending, between prohibition and enjoyment, usually presented as a major clash between two antithetical alternatives, is a similar case of mutual contamination, of mutual engagement? If this is the case, then what lies ahead of us is a true theoretical political challenge. The original theory concerning the spirits of capitalism, incorporating the insights of sociology classics like Max Weber and also postmodernists like Baudrillard and Lacanians like McGowan, can be extremely helpful. But it may also be in need of some revision, able to produce a more nuanced account, alert to the paradoxes of such mutual engagement. We may need, in other words, to problematize the idea of a clear-cut differentiation and periodization between prohibition, asceticism on the one hand, and enjoyment, luxury, spending on the other. So the question is, let's do it. What will we find if we start thinking in this alternative fashion? Such a problematization can and should proceed, I think, on both the synchronic and the diachronic axes. It is also bound to produce certain important effects at a strategic level. And in the rest of my lecture, I will deal with these two aspects one by one. Let's start with the synchronic dimension. On the one hand, at the synchronic level, the consumer's call to enjoy may be less liberating than it seems. Todd McGowan himself points to its irreducible link to power and duty. In that sense, what we are dealing with, instead of a strict antithesis or opposition between restraining asceticism and liberating enjoyment, is articulations of ethics, morality, and enjoyment distributed along two seemingly antithetical, but in effect mutually reinforcing axes comprising one single, more or less functional structure. What a careful comparison between the two spirits reveals is that, with all their differences, they do not signify a radical break of cosmological proportions. In both cases, that is to say, certain things remain unchanged. What remains the same is, first of all, the impossibility of realizing the fantasy. So, all these fantasies that we are promised in consumers, they never materialize. What we get is never what we have been expecting. But if this is the case, then the command to enjoy is only revealed as a more nuanced form of prohibition. It continues with other means the traditional function of symbolic law and power. Greater autonomy associated with the new spirit, the second spirit of capitalism, conceals more constraints. In societies of commanded enjoyment, and this is why we put commanded there, which produces this paradox, commanded enjoyment. Enjoyment makes sense predominantly as a duty. Duty is transformed into a duty to enjoy, which is precisely the commandment of the superego. The seemingly innocent and benevolent call to enjoy, as in enjoy Coca-Cola, embodies the violent dimension of an irresistible command. Lacan was certainly one of the first to elaborate on the importance of this paradoxical hybrid when he linked, back in the 50s, the command enjoy with the superego. And I'll give you this famous quote from Lacan. The superego is the imperative of jouissance, enjoy. He was indeed one of the first to detect in this innocent call the unmistakable mark of power and authority. Thus, Lacan is offering a revealing insight on what has been described in mainstream sociological analysis of consumption as the consuming paradox. What is the consuming paradox? While consumerism seems to broaden our opportunities, choices, and experiences as individuals, it also directs us towards predetermined channels of behavior, and thus it is ultimately as constraining as it is enabling. So the command to enjoy is nothing but an advanced, much more nuanced, and much more difficult to resist form of power. It is more effective than the traditional model, not because it is less constraining or less binding, but because its violent exclusionary aspect is masked by its phantasmatic vow to enhance enjoyment, by its productive, enabling facade. It does not oppose and prohibit, but openly attempts to embrace and appropriate the subject of enjoyment. Not only is this novel articulation of power and enjoyment hard to recognize and to thematize, it is even harder to delegitimize in practice, to disinvest consumption acts and disidentify with consumerism. However, without such a disinvestment and the cultivation of alternative administrations of enjoyment, no real change can be effective. Now let me pass to the diachronic aspect. At the diachronic level, the idea present in the original account of a straightforward, linear movement from prohibition to enjoyment, from the first to the second spirit of capitalism, also needs to be re-examined. Clearly, psychoanalytic perspective is bound to introduce a more nuanced picture on the differentiation between the different spirits of capitalism. As we have already seen, the whole debate, most analysts locate the shift from the first to the second spirit around the middle of the 20th century. According to most accounts, it is in the second half of the 20th century, after 1950 basically, that Puritanism gives place to enjoyment. Recent research, however, has revealed that whatever forces were working to challenge the Protestant ethic, they were hardly recent, but could be found to have a pedigree which extended back to a time well before the 20th century. Indeed, signs of erosion of the first spirit of capitalism started to become visible and conscious well before that. I will give you an example. Writing in 1880, Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, describes vividly how mass production prepared the ground for the development of a consumer culture unified around the command to enjoy. And I'll give you a quote from Lafargue. In the face of this double folly of workers killing themselves with overproduction and vegetating in abstinence, the big problem of capitalist production isn't finding producers and increasing their force, but finding consumers, exciting their appetites and creating artificial needs. This is 1880. It could even be argued that the first wave of hedonism and consumerism affected the middle ranks of English society by the second half of the 18th century. Drawing on a neglected tradition going back to the work of Werner Zombart and his famous book called Luxury and Capitalism, recent historical research has documented an unparalleled product and consumer revolution that took place in 18th century Britain. This revolution involved the fascination with new consumer goods, now embraced by middle class extending to professionals, merchants, and industrialists, to ordinary tradespeople and artisans. Far from being the invention of the post-Cold War era, a global consumer society, this is the argument which is all these researchers make, is thus revealed as the very foundation of the industrial world. Which is also, it's very interesting, which was also Werner Zombart's argument, that it was not asceticism that was the catalyst for the development of capitalism, but luxury. It seems then that the relation between commanded enjoyment and bourgeois asceticism was not one of substitution or succession, but one of co-constitution. So, given we have seen how the argument works on both the synchronic and the diachronic dimensions, and given, I think, the destabilization of our original take on the spirits of capitalism on both these two levels, we may have to rethink the relation between the ethics of prohibition, asceticism, and the ethics of enjoyment anew. Even in Weber, the Protestant ethic is presented as an ideal type. And as Colin Campbell has pointed out, it is a fundamental mistake to confuse such a cultural ideal type with a total pattern of behavior which might be identified as characterizing the conduct of individuals or social groups, and hence to confuse an ethic with a type of personality or the behavior typical of a given social position. In theory, Colin Campbell says, individuals cannot conform to two ethics. In practice, it may not be so difficult. In fact, Campbell's reference to the symbiotic relationship between the two opposed ethical orientations introduces a problematic of simultaneous contrast on the one hand, even contradiction, but also, and most crucially, of interdependence between the two spirits. These twin cultures, Campbell points out, ensured the continued performance of those contrasted but interdependent forms of behavior essential to the perpetuation of industrial societies, matching consumption with production, play with work. And we could add official ideal with self-transgression, a distribution of foreign force in which symbolic authority is dominant under the form of a prohibition, with another distribution in which phantasmatic enjoyment is dominant under the form of a call to enjoy. As we learn again from Paul Lafargue, almost from the beginning of bourgeois society, next to the ascetic bourgeois is the bourgeois who has delivered himself, and I'm quoting here, to frenetic luxury, exotic indigestion, and syphilitic debauch. Very soon after acquiring its dominant status, and I'm quoting again, the capitalist class found itself condemned to laziness and forced happiness, to unproductiveness and overconsumption. This is 1880. Such mutual engagement, such cultural tango, has characterized modern societies from their birth and appears essential to their continued existence. So this cultural tango was there all along and never stopped. Both synchronically and diachronically, different ways of controlling, regulating demand and desire and social hierarchy and rank were employed, ranging from the extreme prohibition of sumptuary laws and ascetic morality to the indirect control implicit in the call to enjoy, which is much closer, if you want, to a Foucauldian understanding of power as a productive force and not only as prohibition. And while the overall trends seem to be in favor of a diffusion of the enforced enjoyment model into wider strata of the population, the ethics of sacrifice, the good philosophy of suffering, according to Lafargue, was again called to the rescue whenever deemed necessary. And Mrs. Merkel seems to be nothing but a contemporary preacher of this good philosophy, in a similar way that, as we have already seen, Andrew Mellon was its agent in the 1920s and 1930s. So, in my view, we are currently experiencing another historical turn of this type. And this is also the broad framework within which we could interpret the current crisis of capitalism. The crisis partly results from particular rhythms or tunes this cultural tango has been following, and it will only be resolved through a new crystallization of such relations of mutual engagement. Now, which exact direction these crystallizations will acquire is perhaps the foremost political challenge of our age. What is clear, however, is that no real change can be expected from one more simple shift of the center of gravity from one pole of this system, of this pendulum, if you want, to the other. Both are conditioned by phallic fantasies of fullness. Both operate in ways reinforcing our coercive or voluntary entrapment within unequal and unjust orders of domination. The two models have been alternating all along while coexisting in various forms of mutual engagement, constituting a single functional system. Only the articulation of another ethical type of relation with enjoyment beyond such fantasies of fullness, with a constitutive partiality of enjoyment, would be able to traverse this vicious circle. It may not be entirely coincidental that the duplex modus, the double machine, also sketched by Agamben, works again as a pendulum, as a single apparatus within which one of the two poles can, at each turn, dominate the other. Far from being antagonistic, the poles involved remain secretly in agreement, Agamben says, until the end. And thus, real change requires rendering inoperative the whole system. Is that possible? And how exactly? Only the future will tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yannis. Questions? Sure.
I was just thinking about the relationship between what I meant to say and what I'm trying to say. But if you look at the paradoxes, the political paradoxes, is that usually, historically, leftist governments have been more successful in terms of austerity policies than right-wing governments, at least in Europe. It's very true for Western Europe. I don't know how this would fit into what you were just saying. I mean, because there's a paradox there, because actually usually the right-wing people are very keen to mention the idea that we need austerity, but actually they have a very poor record to kind of deliver that.
Greece would be a good example of that.
Exactly, Greece is a good example too. I mean, because you can transpose that to many different countries. I mean, so I don't know how it would fit into this kind of.
Yeah, there is a paradox there. Maybe, maybe it shows that all this, which is relevant to what I have been arguing, is that all these shifts have to be situated within a larger background, which has remained the same throughout modernity, and is marked by this pendulum movement, which in which you cannot really link. For example, you cannot link the enjoyment drive with a left-wing liberating orientation and the austerity, with which is exactly what you said. There is a much more complex dialectic, and we know there is a mutual engagement on all these levels. For example, if you read the book by Boltanski and Chapello about the second spirit of capitalism, the main argument is that the liberating potential of May '68 was eventually co-opted by capitalism, and that led into a new type of society, consumer society, and a new type of economy. So it's a very nice indication of these very paradoxical passages. You know, something which emerges as a left-wing or something movement eventually becomes something which is used in order to perpetuate the current system, and vice versa. It can also go the other way around.
Well, it seems to me, actually, just to pick this up, that capitalism is, in this sense, a very flexible system, that it can turn even the criticism of capitalism into something that can be consumed. Since you just mentioned '68, I think this is the perfect example how industries, particularly entertainment industries, capitalize, so to say, the criticism of capitalism. And in a similar way, of course, I think capitalism can also, in a way, kind of marry, so to say, together asceticism and consumerism by developing some kind of a consumption of asceticism at the same time. I mean, in a very blunt way, I could say, all right, they cultivate, let's say, like the industries of sports, cultivating the well-trained body, which again is fit for production then later on. So these things are kind of, it's really hard to separate these, the two different spirits of capitalism. Maybe this is a third phase that we're talking about now. Since you said, well, okay, we have the predomination of asceticism, like before the Second World War, and then from the 1950s onwards, the predomination of consumerism. Maybe we're entering into another phase in which we have this kind of co-optation of asceticism and consumerism. So a consumerism of asceticism is, I mean, I'm wondering whether this is kind of a debatable approach.
Yeah. Can I just add something to what Marcus said there? I mean, yes, this is one of the things I was thinking about. Yannis, as you were talking, and your kind of periodization here of the 1950s and the emergence of consumerism. I think one of the things we shouldn't forget is that the sort of the culture of excess, the commanded enjoyment, is something that really accelerated in the 1970s. And this in itself was a response to an earlier crisis, the crisis of stagflation, the crisis of stagnation from sort of the 1950s up to the mid-1970s. Now, the important thing about this was, of course, that it was exactly accompanied by austerity. In the UK, the US, a little bit later in Germany, we had a period of stagnation, almost 10 years stagnation of wages, at the same time that we had a commanded enjoyment. And it was this, of course, which led to this period of expansion of private debt as well as public sector debt. So the commanded, the excess, the culture of excess went hand in hand with a form of austerity. We just didn't notice it at the time. Okay, but certainly the stagnation of wages, of living standards, it took place in the US, the UK, and other countries at that time.
Okay, let me go back from where you started.
Tell me later.
Because you started by talking about capitalism as a system which manages very easily, maybe more easily than other systems, to incorporate what is against. And this reminds me of something. Alain Badiou somewhere says, he puts it in a very interesting way. He says the way capitalism acknowledges criticism is by transforming it into a product. So you have this very interesting. And I was in Milan a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed now we have with the Occupy Wall Street movement, we have some sort of populism coming back to the agenda, and the slogan "We the people" has been used very much in the media and in protests and so on. And I was in the central station in Milan, which is a huge building, and I saw the new campaign of Marlboro clothing, and the slogan is "With the people." And it has these huge posters of ordinary people with their first names, and then the slogan is "With the people." So you see how this, precisely what you said, works. Now, you also try to put forward an argument that perhaps we have entered the third phase in which this contamination. But my argument, I don't know whether it was made very clear, was that, if I can put it like that, we were all along in this third phase. That this idea that you have this clash is important, but it does not really cover the whole picture. That you already have this engagement, this contamination, and already, perhaps you also have it before capitalism. It's not only capitalism that, of course, with capitalism you have an acceleration of these rhythms in which this mutual contamination takes place. But it is also the case in probably earlier. And we have, for example, with relation to the early phases of capitalism, we have this new. There are many books published recently, very interesting historical research. For example, people who are researchers who are studying wills. You know, in some places in India you can find wills dating back to the 17th, 16th century. And one has to study what did these people own. And the assumption up to now was that they just owned, very basic stuff. And it turns out that even relatively poor people had in their possession many luxury goods. So that creates a very different interpretation of how this contamination was working all along, and so on and so forth. So my argument would be that we are already in the third phase, probably with the beginning of modernity, and because this, I had to present a very small part of this argument, because this argument, you can also add an anthropological twist to the argument, and go back, because you have a logic of, and if you go to potlatch, if you go to so-called primitive societies, you have similar types of behavior, and also, in order, if I wanted to give a genealogy of the Western story, one would definitely have to go back to the court society. I think this idea of commanded enjoyment is very much related to what we call conspicuous consumption, which is what the court society. It is the defining characteristic of an aristocratic morality. That you have to spend, you have to engage in conspicuous consumption. Otherwise, you will lose your status within the court. And it is not something that you do it because you enjoy it, you have to do it. So you have this commanded aspect there. And then gradually you have a democratization of that principle. First the bourgeoisie adopts it, and then gradually in the 20th century, it is very, you can see that very clearly if you study particular goods. For example, Oriental carpets. There are very interesting papers and books about anthropological, ethnographical studies about Oriental carpets. Was a luxury good enjoyed only by the aristocracy. If you see the paintings by Holbein, the ambassadors have these amazing Oriental carpets. Today, and then of course a bourgeois house would need to have, and then today, if you go to IKEA, they sell handmade Oriental carpets. So everybody is entitled to that. Sorry.
There's three questions here. Should I take them together? Yeah, and then we'll first.
Okay. What's your personal stance on this question? Do you think that this single bipolar system is effective, or it needs to be changed or replaced?
Yeah. The debate on the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism has always puzzled me because it seems to be quite narrow. It is often confined to Protestant Europe, and it seems to be affected by a sort of anti-Catholic prejudice. What you said about Zombart and Lafargue and their thesis is actually supported by historical evidence, by historical sources, because in Catholic countries like France and Italy, and I'm talking of Italy before the unification, of course, I'm talking of 17th and 18th century France and Italy, there were many writers who supported the idea that only through the introduction and I would say use of luxury goods, capitalism could develop. This was the philosophy of Louis XIV. Louis XIV expelled the Huguenots, that is the Calvinists, from France, and on the other hand, he somehow drove the aristocracy to spend more and more and to bring more and more to Versailles, also to support national economy. This was supported by his minister Colbert. And if we, for instance, consider the debate on Jewish emancipation in Italy, on the rights of the Jews, on tolerance for the Jews, from the early 17th century to the late 18th century, most of the defenders of the Jews said, the Jews must be tolerated, they must be given, they must not be taxed excessively, because they are the importers of luxury goods to Venice, to Milan, especially to northern and central Italy, and they significantly help capitalism. So I think very often all these German authors, from Weber especially, and also those who somehow tried to oppose Weber, are really affected by a sort of I don't know if they had prejudices against Catholic Europe or just neglected, unwillingly neglected Catholic Europe. And this is what I want to ask you. As if we consider the focus on religion that the debate has always had, don't you think that somehow Catholic ethics, once it was freed from the idea that money is stercum diaboli, that is the devil's shit, sorry for the word, but it was irrelevant to salvation, to be rich or poor was irrelevant to salvation. Don't you think that Catholic ethics has helped individualist and consumerist capitalism more than Protestant ethics has done with the other paradigm? Does it?
I think command enjoyment requires spare time. I think of the American frontier, when you're chopping wood all summer to heat the house, when you're washing clothes in a bucket, and for a year I washed my clothes in the bathtub at one point, and the weekends are exhausting. And buying a washing machine became a transformative experience. I remember sitting in the living room and asking my wife, you know what I'm doing? I'm doing the laundry because I'm sitting still. And I think technology is one of the things that really makes the command economy, or the command enjoyment, mass producible. If you look at the courts were only available if you had a staff of thousands, stitching the dresses and preparing the food. There were no electric mixers back then, they still had chocolate mousse. And so all of this stuff, all these labor-saving devices are things that make enjoyment or spare time, leisure time activities a possibility. And I think that's one of the things that, at least in America, we experienced and began to experience right after World War II, when the whole war economy was transformed into a civilian economy, and that's when you started getting massive numbers of home appliances, and I mean, everybody had all of these things that gave them enormous amounts of spare time. And then when you have spare time, what do you do with it? Well, you work more. No, you don't work more. You buy a house at a lake, you buy another car, you buy a boat, you develop leisure time activities. And that's why the leisure industry has skyrocketed in the United States. I mean, it's one of the most Disneyland, Disney World, you go for entertainment. You go to, theme parks. Some people go to theme parks.
Shall I?
Yeah.
No, the first question, is this bipolar system effective or needs to be changed? It could be both. It's not one or the other. It has been effective. It's still here. It has conditioned social life, political life, and economic behavior within modernity quite effectively. It is in some sort of crisis at the moment, but we don't know how this will develop. Does it need to be changed? Obviously, this is a question of preference, and in my view, it needs to be changed. Can it be changed? God knows. Second question, that was a good one. About the Catholic, yes. I think this is very, well, first of all, even if we stay within the Protestant camp, it seems that, I mean, I'm not a sociologist of religion, but it seems that the picture is much more complex than Weber would allow. There's a book by Colin Campbell, which is called The Romantic Ethic and the Spirit of Modern Consumerism, which plays with Weber's title, and he uses a lot of Zombart. And I think there's a whole chapter, or there's a certain part of the book which deals with orientations within Protestantism, which had nothing to do with this spirit that Weber describes. So even within, so you can imagine, if you go and then study the Catholic example, or the Greek Orthodox, if you want, or the Eastern Orthodox example, things become much more nuanced and complex and so on and so forth. But I think, however, that Weber does capture a certain part of the picture. You have this force playing some kind of role, and you also have the opposite playing a role. And I think what is important is to try to read them together. I think this is and of course you can do that at the level of sociology of religion, and see how, I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done on that. And also, you can also make it even broader. For example, studying the relation between Islam and capitalism, what is happening there. What are the forces that influence that aspect? So I basically agree with you. I think that it's a much more complex. And actually, Zombart is somebody who's almost never discussed. And it's very interesting to see. For example, Luxury and Capitalism is out of print. It hasn't been published for the last 40, 50 years. It's very interesting. And it's a very interesting book, and it's a very detailed, and I was surprised when I managed to find it and read it. It's a very interesting repression, I think, which is operating at that level. Now, going to the third question about technology. Obviously, speaking about our experience, we have to take into account that leisure and spare time. On the other hand, enjoyment and spare time are relative concepts. As you were speaking, what came to my mind was a very well-known book by Marshall Salins, a very important anthropologist, which is called Stone Age Economics. And it's a book of economic anthropology that studies hunter-gatherer societies. And Salins, again, you have a very detailed analysis based on some of these communities that still exist in certain parts of the world, and also memoirs of people like Captain Cook and people who met these people in the pristine form in the Middle Ages or early modernity. And Salins makes the argument that hunter-gatherer society was the first affluent society. And he also makes the argument in terms of spare time. He says that these people, and there are very detailed calculations of working time, they were definitely working less than we. And they had a lot of spare time. Now, what exactly they were doing with that spare time is a different issue. But the strategy in order to achieve that was to desire less. It was not to desire more. If you desire more and more and more, if you have this phallic fantasy about which I was speaking, then you have more spare time, and then you have to work more in order to get the money in order to use your spare time effectively and acquire the last model of mobile phone or car or whatever that will allow you to do that and will give you a particular status, that it creates a certain short circuit there. These societies did exactly the opposite. They were keeping desires at a fairly low level. And that meant that they did have all that spare time at their disposal. But it's a very, obviously you cannot go back to that. And this is the argument by Salins again, it's not that this was some sort of lost golden age. Quite the contrary. But from that point of view, they had a very different strategy of conditioning desire, enjoyment, and so on and so forth.
Do we have any more questions, or shall we move to the foyer and have a glass of wine and discuss over that? Okay, I'd like to thank again then.
This program is brought to you by AUBGTalks. For more, please visit us at aubg.bg/talks.